I just completed my first ever Ironman 70.3 in Santa Cruz, California 2 weeks ago. And in today's episode of the Get Over Yourself podcast, I'm going to be sharing my 10 strategies or my tips and tricks on what I wish I knew before starting the race. Not all of you out there on this podcast to listen are going to be doing your Ironman or any kind of triathlon for that matter. But I thought this would be a fun episode to show a little bit of my journey that I've been preparing for the past year now, and some of the tips and tricks that I wish I absolutely knew before starting the race. These tips and tricks are coming from myself as well as my cousin who ran the race, and things that are just common errors that a lot of triathletes are probably going to miss on their first attempt. The Ironman 70.3 was my first triathlon ever. I grew up as a swimmer. I run occasionally. My bike was, as we'll get into, was absolutely horrendous. So these are the tips and tricks I would share with literally anyone who was, like me, an absolute beginner on the Ironman stage or triathlons for that matter. So guys, today's episode is going to be a little bit quicker pace. We're going to get into the fun of it, and you have to stay tuned for tip number 10 because it's the most important advice I will give you. Whether you're running a triathlon, an Ironman, or any type of event coming up soon, you have to be ready for it. So with that being said, let's jump into today's episode. So guys, as I mentioned, I am a complete newbie when it comes to the triathlon world. To be quite honest, the reason why my cousin and I ran this race was we were on a cruise together. We had a massive family reunion, and him and I were sitting in the hot tub, and we were talking about this is last December 2023, right before the new year. And we're going over what are some of our New Year's resolutions for 2024? What are some of the things we want to accomplish? And as we were sitting in the hot tub, we kind of joked with each other, and we're like, he was a good biker. I'm a pretty good swimmer. And we said, hey, we should do an Ironman together. Get out of our comfort zones a little bit. Stop going to the gym to get big and strong for a little bit and go see if we can actually endure something a little bit more difficult. And at the time, it was kind of a pipe dream. We didn't know if anything would ever come out of it. But after the cruise, we messaged each other and we said, okay, I think we actually want to do this. And we waited a couple months, started our training, signed up for the race together, and eventually it was race day. And I feel like my cousin and I, we did a good job at kind of understanding the basics of the race, but not the intricate details that really make the difference. We were very good on our training. We worked every single day, which is a huge factor towards all of this. But at the end of the day, the little intricacies that I'm going to be sharing with you in today's episode are what would have made the difference in a lot of instances on getting a faster time, being more comfortable throughout the race, making sure our body was prepared for it more. And these are the tips and tricks I'm going to be sharing with you right now. So tip number 1, once again, this is coming from somebody who just completed their first Ironman 70.3. I did not know this going in. I always just assumed right when you exit the water after the 1.2 mile swim, the transition station would be right next to the water. And that was not the case. We had about a 5-minute run where we had to exit the water right after our swim and sprint up to the transition station. Now, another factor, not every single race is going to have the exact same transition stage. And so if you get out of the water, you can run to your first one, you can hop on your bike the 56 miles. In some races, you're also going to have another transition stage where you need to drop off your shoes and all of your nutrition and whatnot for your run portion. And so that's something you need to consider when you're signing up for any of your races here in the future. You need to see where the transition stages are. So when we first got to Santa Cruz, a day before the race, we were going to check in and we recognized, okay, the beach is over here where we're doing our open water swim, but it's a couple thousand yards to get to the transition station. And we didn't quite understand how that worked at first. And so we talked to somebody who looked like they knew what they were doing a little bit more than us. And they said, nope. So you get out of the water and you have to run back to this place. And so a good piece of advice I would share with that as well. Some people brought sandals because it was a gravelly road and you could have got hurt on your feet, which is obviously a horrible thing if you're about to bike 56 miles and then go run a half marathon. So just make sure you know where your transition stations are, especially when you're getting out of that swim. As soon as the gun sounds and you jump in that water and you're breathing hard and you get out, a lot of things are just going to be super confusing. You're going to have people there cheering you on, but you're not going to know where to go or what to do. You're going to come out of that water in kind of a daze or a fog, and you're going to have to start running to that transition station. Some of them will be a little bit close to where you finish your swim, but if it's anything like the Santa Cruz, you will have a couple minute run where you have to go, and that does not include the time or the mileage that it would for the half marathon, unfortunately. Advice piece number 2, this is something that applies directly to the bike portion of the race. And I'll get into this. This connects to advice piece number 10 I'll be sharing here in just a little bit. But advice piece number 2, mechanics are incredibly scarce on the course. You are not going to see as many mechanics as you think you will. When I was signing up and I was looking on the Ironman website, on the Santa Cruz website, they made it seem like if you had any kind of issues with your bike or any of your gear, you would basically be able to raise your hand and there'd be a mechanic right there within a matter of a couple minutes to come and help you. And that is absolutely not the case. They have a mechanic right at your transition station where they're able to fix your bike the day before or actually at the event. And I actually saw this right as I was hopping on my bike right after my swim. I hopped on my bike to do the transition. I was reaching right around the corner right when you mount your bike, and a guy was running back right past me because his bike already had a flat tire from the night before, and he was feeling it right before he jumped on his bike. So it's a great opportunity the day before or even the day of the event to go and check your bike out with those mechanics. Make sure everything's working properly, because if something happens while you're actually on the bike portion, it's going to be hard to wave a mechanic down. You're going to have issues. You're going to have to radio it in. You're going to have to find some kind of race official or a police officer or anything like that who's maintaining the scene there on the race, and make sure that they can radio it in for you, because you're going to have a very, very difficult time actually finding one on the actual race day. Okay, step number 3. I should preface with this. When it comes to athletic training, I've always been an athlete, but I'm not the best when it comes to my nutrition before big events. Be that some of my old water polo games or baseball games or anything like that, especially for this race where I'm using so much of my energy and burning so many calories. I needed to watch my nutrition a little bit better the entire week before the race. So the night before, my cousin, my family, and everyone else, my wife and I, we went out to a nice pasta restaurant and we carbo loaded. We had a hefty plate of pasta. We made sure we were all ready. That evening, I had a protein shake. And then the morning of the actual race, I had some greens so I could wake my body up. I had a little bit of electrolytes through Gatorade. I had a Monster Energy drink, not an entire can because that would give me too much of the jitters, just to wake me up a little bit. I had a couple sips of a Monster Energy drink. I had some bagel. I had a bagel, a couple bananas, and I also had one of the Slim Jim protein bars. And so when I was eating all this food, I felt prepared. The night before, I was feeling really good. But something I learned after the race is, since you're burning so many calories through, especially on the bike portion of the race, even if you have your little nutrition packets, you have your gels, you have candies, you have energy chews, and the few little things that they'll have at the aid stations to help you out, your body is burning so many calories. And it's, especially if this is your first event and you've been training just for a few months, it's not used to burning that many calories at once. And so what I read after the fact, and I'll include these links in the episode description today, but what I learned after the fact is a lot of times you actually have to start preparing your body with more food the week beforehand, and you have to watch what you're actually eating the week beforehand. And I'm not the best example of what to eat or how to diet right before a race, but I will include some of those resources once again in the description of today's episode. A lot of people will have some sort of diet they strictly follow throughout the entire segment of their training. If you're like me, though, and you just have a hectic lifestyle and you're not trying to change all of your efforts right before you do something life-changing like this race was for me, make sure you at least dial in the week before. You're eating healthy. You have enough carbs and enough proteins that are going to get you through the race. You also have enough energy, and your body's ready for that, because that's something I highly underestimated. Tip number 4 actually goes back to the swim portion. I read online and watched so many YouTube videos telling me that you always want to take the outside edge because there's going to be a million people crowding around the corners right when you're doing the swim. So on the Santa Cruz race, the map was quite simple. We started on the left side of the pier if you're looking out to the ocean. We swam out, we took a right turn, we took one more right turn, and we swam back. And so it was almost like a giant U around the pier in Santa Cruz. And many of the races are going to follow the same pattern where you swim out a distance, you cut over, and then you swim back. And so a lot of times on these YouTube videos I was watching before my race, the instructors and other triathletes were telling me that, hey, you want to take the outside edge because everyone's going to be crowding right around that 90-degree turn so they can cut off as much distance as they possibly can and they don't swim any further. And I'm sure there are cases where that is great advice, especially if you're swimming in the top 15% of the swimmers at the race event. But if you are going back a few minutes, you're not jumping into the water as soon as the race starts and you're going back with a little bit of a slower crowd, I highly recommend you actually aim straight for those buoys and you take those tight turns. The entire time, I started right in the middle, right when I jumped in the water and I started swimming, and I popped my head up on one of my strokes for a brief second, and I looked and there was no one to my right. So I just quickly drifted over, and the entire time I had the inside edge. And I also only bumped into somebody roughly 2 times the entire swim, which is also something I was not expecting. Inside a lot of these videos that I watched beforehand, everyone was saying how chaotic it is. There's elbows flying. There's people kicking you in the face. And once again, I did not personally experience that hardly at all when I took the inside edge. And I think so many people who were doing the race for the first time or the first couple races, they heed that advice and they say, okay, I'm going to always take the outside edge and not take the sharp corner. And so it made that almost more chaotic. I'm a confident swimmer. If you're a confident swimmer, I highly recommend taking the inside edge. It's going to cut off a little bit of your time. And I noticed that there was less people there. I'm not promising you that for your race, but especially if you're going in a group where you fit directly in and you're not super slow, but you're not super fast, it could work out perfectly. And just for reference, if you're curious, the gun sounded at 7 a.m. and I was going with the group that was supposed to be finishing the 1.2 mile swim between 32 to 35 minutes. And so not like the uber fast swimmers, but also not at the back of the pack. And I was having plenty of enough room to make sure I could take those inside edges and not get grouped with everyone who was doing the slower swim on the outside. Okay, tip number 5. This is something I actually learned right before the race, right before we were heading down to the beach to get our warm-up swim in and eventually start the actual race. 2 people who had done races were sitting right next to me at the transition station. I was checking my bike. I was making sure everything looked good, and I was loading up on my wetsuit. And I noticed as they were putting on their wetsuits, they were getting Vaseline and deodorant along their wrists and along their neckline and on their ankle line. And I asked them what they were doing. And it was basically a way where as soon as you would get out of the water, one of the most annoying things, and I can attest to this, was taking off the wetsuit. I didn't have anyone there to rip off the suit. It was super draggy against all my clothes underneath. I was wearing my tri-suit ready to hop on the bike and get going again. And so it actually took me a couple minutes to get the wetsuit off. And by then it was like dragging and I was trying to run back to the transition station. It was a pain. And so I highly recommend doing what my counterparts at the transition station were doing. They got the Vaseline and the deodorant and they rubbed it on any areas where 1, they could chafe, and 2, where they needed to rip the wetsuit off quickly so they wouldn't have any issues. Speaking of chafing, I used chamoy butter. This is something that made a huge impact on my race because I was able to put it all over my body, any parts of myself that would chafe under my armpits, my groin area, anything like that. I was able to put the chamoy butter and I hardly chafed at all. Whereas on the contrary, my cousin, he forgot it on the actual bike ride, which in my opinion is the most uncomfortable one of them all. He forgot to put his chamoy butter on and he was rashing everywhere. You come out of that salt water, especially in the open water swims. And when you hit that bike, you are rubbing and your body is it has a lot of friction with the clothing you're wearing. And so I highly recommend getting that deodorant, Vaseline, and then some sort of butter where you can make sure you're not actually going to be getting any chafing or anything like that. Okay. Tip number 6. This one should have also probably been a given for a first-time triathlete, but with all the hectic stuff going around, your heart's pumping even the day before, you're getting all excited, ready for the race. Then actually come race day, you have so many things you're thinking about. This could be a very easy oversight. So step number 6 is make sure you lay your gear out properly. When I went to my transition station, I racked my bike up and it'll go in a pattern where you'll see that certain bikes are aimed one way and then you flip it on the next way. So one bike will be facing north and then the next bike next to it will be facing south and then over to the next, it'll be north again and so on. So when you're actually gearing up at the transition station, it is very crucial that you have your gear laid out properly because there's going to be so many people frantically flying around, making sure all their stuff's there, making sure they're all geared up and ready to go on the bike or the next run portion. It's going to get chaotic very, very quickly. And so my biggest recommendation on this section on the transition is make sure you have all of your gear laid out appropriately. For the bike section, put your sunglasses inside of your helmet so you can easily throw those on. Make sure you have your bike shoes. You can either clip them directly into the pedals, or if you prefer to actually slip them on, just have your socks ready right there. Have everything lined up exactly how you'll put it on in order so you can make sure you could do that transition quickly and efficiently because everyone's going to be chaotic around you. You need to lock in and make sure that process is simple for you. Tip number 7, this actually correlates a lot with the transitions that I was talking about. Make sure you know where your station is on the transition. Once again, come race day, it's easy to forget where you're at because there's so much going on and you have all your competitors running around you. You just got out of your swim or your bike ride and you have so much chaos around you. You're tired, you're fatigued, your muscles hurt. You're going to forget where you parked all of your stuff. And I remember laid out right when I put my bike up the night before the race, I racked my bike and got all my gear out. And I was looking around and I was trying to find waypoints. This is a video I saw right before my race that gave me this tip. And I would highly recommend this. So as soon as you rack your bike, look around the entire event, make sure you have waypoints on how to find your station correctly. So I looked where I racked my bike. It was directly across a set of palm trees. And then directly to the left was a set of porta potties. And then behind me was a sign for the actual Ironman event. So I knew as soon as I came out of that water and as soon as I finished my bike ride, I was going to run to that middle point between the porta potties, the sign, and the palm trees. And that's exactly where I would have my aid station. And believe it or not, people, if you don't find a central point on where you're putting all of your stuff, they'll assign it to you. But if you don't remember where you're putting your stuff, you're going to have people around you who are frantically looking for their station because they went to the wrong row or they went to the wrong section. And there's literally thousands of other bikes and other shoes and every backpack and everything like that. And a lot of gear looks the same, especially for these high-class triathletes. They have a lot of similar gear. Or if you're running a little bit of a smaller operation like me, a lot of us have the same exact gear, the same backpacks, helmets, bikes. And so it's going to be chaotic, and you're not going to know where your stuff is unless you find a central waypoint so you can run straight there after every transition. Tip number 8 is actually super important, and it's something I had to keep reminding myself throughout the entire race. You, unless you're one of the top triathletes in the world, and if you are, I don't know why you've stuck around this long in the video, but if you are running one of your first races, you are competing with yourself. You're not competing with anyone else, you're competing with yourself. This is a message I had to keep reminding myself throughout the race because I would see at certain points somebody pass me and I would think, okay, I need to speed up and I have to go catch them and I have to beat them. And after a while, I recognized that was not a smart strategy. However you have been training for your upcoming race, make sure you're sticking to that training. At certain points, I recognized on the bike, I was actually going a little bit too fast. On my run, I wasn't pacing myself how I wanted to. The swim was like the only thing that I actually felt confident in where I wasn't worrying about anyone else and I was just doing my own thing. But you have to remember you're competing with yourself and you're not competing with anyone else. Of course, it's a race and you're trying to beat other people. But at the end of the day, if this is one of your first races, huge piece of advice I would give is make sure you're just finishing and make sure you're competing with yourself. Prove to yourself that you're able to finish this event. If you absolutely love doing these races and you want to continue doing them, sure, in the future, go and compete against the other competitors, the other triathletes out there, and go see if you can beat your time in their time. But at the very first race, your very first few races, make sure you just get out there and you compete with yourself and don't worry if somebody passes you. In the long run, you want to run your race, not the race that they're trying to make you run. Tip number 9, aid stations do not always have what you will need. This is something I was very naive as well, and I understand this changes per what race you're actually running. I had a friend of mine that they had Monster energy drinks when they were actually on their race course, and so they had energy and he didn't need to focus on that as much. On my race event, they were very good. Of course, they're always going to have water, and for the most part, from what I've heard, they're always going to have some sort of orange slice, bananas, and electrolytes. But the issue is, once you get so far along on the race with your 56-mile bike ride and your half marathon, your stomach and your body is going to need actual food. And so I packed a protein bar, a few gels, and some energy chews. But the issue was sometimes later on in the race, when I'd be getting up to an aid station, they didn't have the fuel that my body needed. And so what's important is you need to recognize what the fuel your body needs before you go to the race. And even if it adds a little bit of weight on your back, if you put it in your back pockets or on your bike at some portion, if you have a little carrier, it's worth the little bit of extra weight to make sure your body's prepared for it. At certain points, my entire legs were cramping up because you're going through these transition after transition, hustling, and your entire body's going to shut down unless you fuel it properly. At certain aid stations, they also had different things. At some, they had sodas. At some, they had potato chips to get something salty inside of your mouth. But they don't have it at every single aid station. The only guarantee that I had at the Ironman 70.3 in Santa Cruz was there was electrolytes at every aid station and water. That was the only guarantee. So if you need other things for your body, make sure you're not always relying on the aid stations, especially on the bike portion, because there was fewer than I originally thought. So make sure you have the appropriate fuel for your body and don't always rely on the aid stations. Last point about the aid stations is you have to remember a lot of these people out working at them are volunteers. They're local community members. They're just excited you're there in their community running this hard race. And you need to make sure you're appreciative as well. And just to remember that they're there to support you. And I remember at one point, after a couple things had gone wrong inside of my race, two different kids were trying to hand me a water bottle, and they were like fighting over who was going to actually give it to me. And in the moment, I was very stressed, and I was just thinking to myself, I don't care which one of you gives me the water bottle, just somebody give me the water bottle. But after a couple steps after I had gotten the water, I just remembered, hey, I need to give them a little bit of patience here. I know I'm struggling with my race right now, but they're just volunteers doing their best. So always make sure at the aid stations and throughout the entire race, you thank the volunteers and you show a little appreciation for what they're doing for you on race day. Tip number 10 is the most important thing I could share with you, whether you're training for an Ironman 70.3, a full Ironman, Olympic triathlon, or any other physical event, and frankly, any event inside of your life, period. Tip number 10 is prepare for the worst and be ready to tackle it. So the big caveat to my entire race is that while I was on the bike portion, something I was already scared of going into the race, it was the category I was most afraid of. It's the category I probably trained the hardest, but also had the most hiccups with. I was not ready for what was going to be happening. At about mile 14, give or take, I had my first flat tire. Guys, I bought my bike 6 months before the triathlon so I could actually start preparing for it. I'm not a road biker. I'm not even a mountain biker. I was not ready for what was going to be happening. The swim, I was already confident in. The run, I was just going to finish. But the bike portion absolutely destroyed me. I was on pace to hit a 19 mile per hour bike ride, which was pretty good for me. Usually I was averaging around 17 miles per hour. And so I was on pace to beat my average, and I was flying through this course. Everything that I had trained for, I felt very confident. On the hills, I was going cruising strong, and on the downs, I was locking in, and I wasn't having any issues. But then around mile 14, I lost my first tire. So I hopped off my bike. I got my little CO2 canister I was carrying in my pouch, and I filled up my tire. I threw it back in, and I started pumping again. And lo and behold, about 3 minutes later, the tire went flat again. At this point, I'm freaking out because I frankly did not prepare enough on the bike portion. This is something that I was not ready for. I didn't prepare changing my tires enough. I only changed them probably twice the entire time where I was doing my training. And so I pulled over, and I was already frantic because I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I only had 2 flats the entire time I was training for this race. And of course I get a flat tire when it's actual race day. Of course. It's like the most stereotypical thing you can think of. So I pull over on the side of the road. I open up my kit, and I'm ready to start tackling this tire and making sure my tube's going to be fixed. And what do I see? I was not prepared. I didn't have my 2 tire levers to pop off the tire and make sure I was setting the tube back in place. I didn't have them. So now I'm even more frantic because I didn't have the equipment. I had a tube, I had a pump, I had CO2, I was ready to go, but I couldn't even get the tire off. So I hurry and I waved down a police officer who was working the event. He was going up Highway 1, making sure everyone was doing good. I waved him down and I asked him if he had communication with the group so he can call out a mechanic for me. He called him out, but long story short, guys, it took over 55 minutes for a mechanic to get to me. This is why in tip number 2, I suggested that you probably shouldn't always rely on mechanics because it takes a long time for them to find you. There's 2,000 other applicants who are running the same race. There's people who probably paid more money for you, so the mechanics will go to them first, who will exchange tires and everything. You have to make sure you're ready for this. And this is an area I completely failed in. I didn't have my tire levers. So I waited 55 minutes. At one point, I also tried to get like 2 twigs of sticks to get it under there so I could pop up the tire. It was not working whatsoever. Finally, after 55 minutes, mechanic pulls up. He fixes my tube. I'm already way behind. I'm literally an hour behind on my entire bike ride at this point, and I keep going. I saw hundreds upon hundreds of the athletes passing me at this point, and it was devastating. I just remember the entire 55 minutes I was trying to move my legs so they didn't start cramping up. I was stretching. I was eating a little bit of my gels and my energy chews so I didn't lose nutrition. But it was the most antagonizing 55 minutes of my life because I saw racer after racer after racer, people that I was in front of, and I had outswam and I had done better at that point, and they were passing me. And I was so frustrated. But finally, after the 55 minutes, the mechanic shows up, he fixes my tube, and I get on my way again. I make it about another 15, 16 miles. I make it to the turnaround point roughly soon after, and I had another pop. Long story short, guys, I ended up having 4 pop tires in this entire race, and I was not prepared for them whatsoever. And these are sort of things that you have to be prepared for. I'm not saying you're always going to carry 4 extra spare tubes with you. I'm not saying you're going to have these exact same issues. But what you need to do is make sure you have a plan and you're ready to tackle it if things start going to hell. And so when I lost my second tire, I was so unbelievably ticked because here I am, already lost almost an hour of race time. I am trying to gain some ground so I don't get DQ'd because that was another fear I was having since I was so behind on my bike at that point. And I start cruising in. And at this point, I recognize I'm like, if it takes another 55 minutes for a mechanic to get to me, I cannot be doing this. And so I just rode on it while it was flat. And luckily at this point, there was less racers out there because everyone had already passed and everyone was farther along. And so a couple miles later, I saw the mechanic. He fixed my tube again and I kept riding. And then it happened again. And the same thing, I just kept riding on it. I scraped my rim. I have to go get a new rim for my bike at this point. but I was able to get through it. And it was just so frustrating. And the last time it popped, the fourth time it popped, it was when I was cruising in. I was 4 miles from the transition station, and I just bore down, and I just made it to the transition station, threw my bike on the rack, and started running. But at the end of the day, guys, there is going to be instances inside of these races that do not go according to plan. I probably would not have planned for 4 pop tires, but what I could have done is planned for the first one. I lost 55 minutes of my race because I was underprepared and I didn't have my tire levers. Overall, I still probably would have lost the other 3 tires. To this day, I don't know what's exactly wrong with it. I still have to take it into the mechanic, but I had those issues. I could have fixed the first one to save over an hour of race time. The other ones, I just had to put my head down and I bore through it. And that was something I'm very proud of. I rode over 13 miles in total on a flat tire throughout the entire 56-mile bike ride. But at the end of the day, what I do recognize is if I was prepared for the first one, I could have cut off at least an hour of my bike time. And so that's my suggestion on tip number 10 there is make sure you're ready to prepare for the worst and just tackle it. You're going to have instances inside of your swim where you're freaking out, or on the run where you get mad cramps and you don't know what to do, or on the bike portion, you're going to get pop tires. But at the end of the day, what makes you Ironman and what makes you more capable than majority of humans on this planet is being able to bear down and make sure you can actually accomplish the goal you set out to. While I was on that bike portion, I was praying nonstop. I remember, I don't think I've said that many verbal prayers out loud in a long, long time, just pleading with God, saying, hey, I need some strength. I don't know if I can do this alone. I remembered all the training that I had put in. I remembered all my family waiting at these transition stations, ready to cheer me on, flying down to the actual event, all the money I spent for the event. And that's what motivated me to keep pushing, even when I lost 4 tires. And so that's my end piece of advice. My one secret piece of advice, advice 11, is make sure you have somebody in your corner or some reason in your corner to keep going. That's special tip number 11 that I wasn't even planning on. Make sure you have somebody in your corner or some piece of motivation that's going to get you through the race. I relied a whole lot on God. I relied on my family, and they were the reason why I was able to finish that race. Because if I was just in my own head the entire time, just screaming, why me, why me, why me, I probably would not have finished that race after the 4th pop tire. But we bore down, we finished it. Wasn't a great time, but once again, I competed with myself. I wasn't going for some crazy record. I competed with myself, made sure I finished, and I accomplished my first ever Ironman 70.3 in Santa Cruz. Guys, if you have any other questions about today's episode, you have any questions about how to prepare, or you want to know a little bit more about my race experience or what you should do in order to prepare, feel free to leave any comments in the comment section down below. I'd be happy to answer. And we'll see you guys next week for a normal episode on the Get Over Yourself podcast, where we continue to interview business owners and where we can grow in our business and in our personal lives. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next week.